to call my next guest the politics reporter for HuffPost is to do him an injustice. He is a terrific journalist. I really always get a lot out of his political coverage. He's a longtime friend of the program. Daniel Marans is officially a politics reporter for HuffPost. He's written a number of interesting stories lately I wanted to catch up on. So without further ado, Daniel, welcome back to the program.
Be here, Richard.
Let's start with the one that story you wrote got a lot of attention, deservedly so, probably closest to my career arc in history of all the ones you've written lately. It was a kind of post-mortem on the Bernie Sanders campaign. I'm not always big on post-mortems except when we can learn from them. And I think there's a lot we need to learn and should learn from the successes as well as the failures of the Sanders campaign. The headline, I don't know if you wrote it yourself, the headline is Bernie Sanders soared back to life, but he couldn't close the deal in terms of the nomination. That certainly is true. So maybe if you don't mind, Daniel, just starting by summarizing what you found in your interviews with folks after Sanders suspended his campaign.
Yeah, I think that it's important to just put the disclaimer out there. I have no idea whether had he done any number of these things differently, whether it would have changed the outcome. Obviously, I have to give a little bit of humility there. But the overarching sort of themes of my story were that Bernie is an individual who is incredibly sort of, I guess, stubborn, independent-minded, set in his ways for very good reasons, including that he spent decades in the United States Congress bucking what people told him was, sort of the politically expedient thing to do. And he grew very wary not only of the conventional wisdom on policy, but of the conventional ideas about what makes for political success. And he had every reason to believe that him speaking his mind and being as authentic as possible and having that disdain for the traditional political playbook had brought him as far as it had. In fact, he exceeded all expectations in 2016. But one difference between 2016 and 2020, and I think this is something that not many other people really got at, was that there were people in the room in 2016, namely Tad Devine and Mark Longabaugh, his consultants, and Jeff Weaver, then his campaign head, who were longtime sort of Bernie teammates, if you will, who were unafraid to get in his face. Mm-hmm. and to push back when they said, Bernie, look, to push back when Bernie's resistance to conventional politicking was an obstacle. This time around, he had a falling out with both Devine and Longabaugh. Jeff Weaver was sidelined in part because of his oversight of the campaign as it was trying to recover from a sexual harassment scandal on its staff. And in their stead, Bernie appointed Faz Shakir, a very respected figure in Washington who had worked for both Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid, but whose last experience working for a political campaign was John Kerry in 2004. And likewise, Ari Rabenhoft, a member of Bernie's Senate staff, who really had only worked on a campaign full-time in 2004 as well, and he ended up becoming the deputy campaign manager. Now, I frame that as a decisive turn of events based on my analysis, as far as I could tell, because their inexperience and frankly also to some extent their Capitol Hill mentality of serving the principle prevented them from checking some of Bernie's worst instincts. And again, those worst instincts are, as I frame it, kind of a double-edged sword. This is a guy who really thinks that whether it's polling or negative campaigning or really kind of tailoring his message to certain constituencies is a sign of inauthenticity. And not only is his authenticity a matter of principle, but he needed more of it, not less of it, if he was going to win again this time. But we see at juncture after juncture, whether it was a question of anticipating that the moderates might consolidate and developing a plan for it, whether it was contrasting with Joe Biden earlier and more consistently, whether it was mainstreaming his image to be more of an FDR Democrat than an anti-establishment democratic socialist, or whether it really was just running a nimble and competent campaign organization that Bernie either lacked the wherewithal himself or refused to surround himself with people who could counterbalance those instincts, such that he was never really able to improvise, experiment, or adapt when the campaign faced unforeseen challenges.
Well, Daniel Marans, as you can imagine, I have opinions on this. And for listeners who don't know, I was the head writer on the 2016 campaign. I'm told I was a campaign employee number 5. So, I had something of an insider view. I was not part of that inner circle that you describe. But I did work directly for Bernie. And I mean, I guess I would start by saying, first of all, I've worth acknowledging that he transformed American politics in many ways. But the difference, and I did not, attempt to work on the 2020 campaign, but the difference, I think, in 2016 was a messaging campaign. 2020 was a campaign for the presidency, and I think I largely, agree with your analysis, but I think there were two schools of thought, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. As an observer from the outside, which was what I am this time around, I think there were two schools of thought in the Bernie campaign, and you've articulated them a little bit. There was an old school Bernie cadre, depleted in ranks somewhat, but represented by Jeff, who I think has had a strong voice, and I think there was the Capitol Hill gang, characterized by the folks you mentioned, good folks. Both sides, have gifts. And then maybe there was a third, which was the kind of, Brianna Joy Gray, David Sirota group. But I don't, candidly, and I want to get your thoughts, I don't think any of them got it right. I think they were all the thing that he should have done, the way he should have cohered. And I think part of it has to do with Bernie's personality. Part of it has to do with the left finding a way forward that allows it to draw people in and not be in a state of constant conflict. Do you get what I'm driving at? I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you might be getting at kind of something that AOC has certainly spoken about in recent weeks when she's been asked about Bernie's campaign, what Ro Khanna and Roseanne DeMauro and, interestingly enough, actor John Cusack thought that Bernie should be taking more of a route to say, look, you already have kind of the hardcore activist left locked up. What you need to work on now is basically giving permission to the mainstream Democrats, to the normies, to make this, make them feel like you don't represent some hippie subculture, to give them an image of an executive they can picture being commander-in-chief in the Oval Office, somebody who they don't see as disdainful of their party affiliation, and somebody who's capable of appealing to swing voters and making deals once in office. And I think, or at least that's my sense, that it's at least part of what you're getting at. One of the things I discuss in the piece that I think is related to that is that Sanders at least professed this idea that his route to success and his route to electability lay in expanding the electorate, and that there would be this untapped group of young progressive voters and really disaffected working class voters of all ages who when reached by his message would emerge from the woodwork and come out to the polls for the first time. Now, I happen to know that they were involved in a lot of persuasion work as well, because I reported on some of their persuasion work toward Biden voters. Other people reported on their persuasion work toward Warren voters. But that not only set expectations, but I also think it became a go-to excuse
Yeah.
from staff members and activists inside and outside the campaign who said, oh, you're concerned about this lack of message discipline, which was very real, or you're concerned about this, the fact that one of our surrogates just quoted Asada Shakur at an Iowa City rally. Well, you're looking at the wrong thing, because the types of people that would be alienated by somebody who was a fugitive for allegedly killing a cop are not the ones that we're trying to get. We're trying to get these new people. It was just this sort of go-to rationalization. There was nothing, no position, no rhetoric, no surrogate, no relationship that Bernie could embrace that was too radical or too outlandish for the moment, because there were these, sort of, in my opinion, somewhat mythical voters out there to be whisked up at a moment's notice. That didn't play out. I think in the most optimistic scenario that ever playing out will take years and years of organizing. And that's why it was always a somewhat risky proposition. And Bernie's stronger standing in 2016, which his campaign never seemed to acknowledge, stemmed so much from the disdain for Hillary Clinton. And in a scenario where Democratic primary voters are more squeamish and more seeking of security because, they're and more risk averse after the election of Donald Trump, and in the absence of a figure like Hillary Clinton, who sort of elicits that kind of disdain, his chances he was always going to be at some structural disadvantage that he needed to account for.
Well, I think that's right. And again, we're talking with Daniel Marans, political reporter for the HuffPost on the 0 Hour. And, Daniel, I would, there's a positive kind of spin on that too, which is, having spent so many years of my life sort of combating the so-called centrist Democrats and all that, I think a lot of those voters, a lot of Hillary voters, and I could tell you stories about that campaign, but a lot of Hillary voters, a lot of people who said, I like Bernie, but it's just too far out. We're not ready for it. It's my instinct talking to them, and also just gut instinct. They want a better world. I think millions of them do. I think there's a Democratic Party culture that says, you can't really have that. We live in the real world.
Right.
And so I think Bernie's challenge this time around, and the left's challenge going forward, is to let them know that it's pragmatic, it's possible, you can live out your ideals. So the sort of punching, I'm a big center puncher. It's
Right.
my whole thing. But the relentlessly punching to the center this time, as opposed to 2016, when I was leading the charge from within the campaign to do it, often making Bernie angry, this time around, I think it was counterproductive. And, I'd be interested in your thoughts about it, but I think a lot of the social media stuff, I think a lot of I would have been all for challenging Joe Biden on campaign finance, on some of his policies, but, personalizing it, it's probably, you and I have known each other a long time, and it might surprise you. I don't think it helped. I think it was a tactical mistake. And I think he had a campaign running 3 different messages at once. But does that make sense to you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there was no, again, whenever, there were obviously figures on his communications team, on his research team, high-level surrogates who either felt inadequately incorporated into the campaign infrastructure or were mismanaged, or simply were not a good fit and needed to be cut loose, but who were taking the campaign into directions strategically and tactically that were not intended and were not part of a broader cohesive strategy. And sort of mouthing off and painting themselves as social media pugilists or warriors against the so-called centrist Democrats was a key element of that. This just gets down to what people have characterized to me as a relative apathy about personnel and management and organizational structure. I mean, this is a guy who raised over $100 million in 2016 and again this time, and never really managed to build a successful nonprofit arm out of that. I mean, Our Revolution, I think that there are a lot of really good people there trying to move it in a positive direction, but certainly in its first couple of years, it's hard to say exactly how it moved the debate, and what its tangible accomplishments were. So, and to get to your point, by the way, in terms of just kind of realism and all of that, I think there would have been two ways for Bernie to really convey that. And one of them, I noted in my piece, he literally had TV ads last time touting his legislative record of bipartisan accomplishments, the VA reform, being the amendment king in the House. He could have thrown in there community health centers, right? There are a number of places to go if you want to talk about Bernie's legislative pragmatism that might demystify that image. But he needed to hit that early and hard this time, and he actually went in the opposite direction. He did not go on the air with that message this time. Instead, there were a couple of YouTube videos that got in the tens of thousands of views, which in Bernie terms is they might as well not have been created given his reach. Right. And then the other phenomenon was sort of just how much he himself and the people under him really failed to solicit, let alone acquire mainstream endorsements. I mean, again, by the end there, they really had just about every major progressive sort of the small cadre of ultra progressive members of Congress and activist organizations and individual activists, but they would constantly sort of roll them out and tout them, and I'd be thinking to myself, this is not who you guys really need, right? I want to know about the businessmen for Bernie. I want to know about veterans for Bernie. I want to know about sort of former Hillary Clinton supporters for Bernie. And those were in shorter supply. And we know that at least one of the reasons for that is because Bernie really hates getting on the phone to talk to colleagues and ask for their support. He told the New York Times, he calls it, he's not terribly tolerant. He doesn't tolerate bullshit terribly well. And that's what he means by bullshit. And I guess that, and that is what it is. But those are just sort of two elements that I picked up on in the course of my reporting. And of course, famously, he the day before the Nevada caucus, he tweeted, we're scaring the Republican establishment, we're scaring the Democratic establishment. At that point, it was clear that he had the caucus wrapped up. And really the following week was the great lost week between Nevada and South Carolina, where it was dominated. I mean, he continued to rail against the establishment in key speeches, and the news cycle was dominated really over the course of several days by his sort of admittedly nuanced and intellectually coherent, but very politically questionable defense of Fidel Castro. So,
well, yeah, I mean, and again, we're talking with Daniel Marans, a political reporter for the HuffPost, good friend of the program, about the Bernie Sanders campaign. The Castro thing was kind of a setup, in my view, but a couple of things. One,
but like, where's the preparation, right? If it's a setup, I mean, that's the thing. They were always complaining about the media bias. It's like, you guys built this alternative media network. They have this enormous reach. And I can tell you that for months and months, they didn't do a terribly good job of working with relatively sympathetic reporters. So even if they needed a robust, aggressive pushback, I question it.
And the immediate response should have been, here is Obama talking about Castro. Tell me how it's different. That's the simple answer. I mean, I guess a couple thoughts, Daniel Marans, if you don't mind. One, maybe I overdid it, but when I worked for him and, Wall Street Journal or somebody would call me for a statement, I almost saw it as a spiritual act of negation. It's all about the candidate. Don't talk to me, talk to, but that's minor, I guess. The one thing that I think was lost in all of this was Bernie's extraordinary gift for communicating with voters who don't agree with him. And you can see that in his Fox town hall in Michigan. You could in Macomb County. You could see it in. I saw it myself, one-on-one, almost in a weird kind of political jujitsu. His primary opponents and their backers were able to turn that gift against him, as in, well, yeah, you go on Fox, as opposed to, here's a guy who can like take our most progressive ideas, and he won't sell every voter, but he doesn't condescend. He talks straight to them. They feel they've been heard, and a few of them will come over, which, by the way, consistent with polling from Working America and other places, that some of these Trump to Obama to Trump voters are open to Green New Deal and things like that. So, in other words, his very strength, which I consider a strength, got used against him, and it's, obviously it's a loss, but it's also a lesson, right? I mean, we can draw from this. You're a journalist, but I'm a partisan journalist, so for the left. So we can draw from this, and I believe, in terms of lessons going forward. What do you think?
Yeah, that was certainly one of the things I had in mind when I wrote my piece, and I don't disagree with your sort of assessment of Bernie's skills speaking one-to-one with those voters. I think that there was a Fox News town hall he did very early on. There were town halls he's done. I remember one with Chris Hayes in Wisconsin that was powerful. Right. But, that kind of gets me to another thing that I think is sort of a left-wing misreading of political tradecraft, which is that you're going to be able to have those one-on-one conversations with every voter. I mean, that there is a passion about door knocking, for example, and people then extrapolate some of the persuasive experiences they've had to larger political strategy. And while speaking to an individual voter at a town hall reaches more people than knocking on a door, it's in the scope of things, if they wanted to promote that, they needed to really just hammer it constantly, because again, when you're trying to dispel a prevailing view about somebody, you really need to go to the opposite extreme in order to emphasize it. So it's the kind of thing that needed to maybe, let's say, be repackaged in paid media and done that way. In terms of lessons, I think I really do hope so. I hope so because I think that politics is healthiest in a liberal democracy when the people in power and the people that try to elect the people in power are introspective about what they need to do to be more in tune with the public and therefore to win and advance their agenda. And I actually think weirdly that in some superficial ways, mostly the Republican Party kind of did that in response to the Obama era and Trump's election, and have moved in at least a rhetorically more kind of nationalist, populist direction. And I haven't seen that really from the Democratic establishment, and I don't really think I've seen that yet from the activist left. I think that people are still falling back on narratives that are comforting and validating and most convenient for them. And those narratives, some of them are, Bernie should have gone harder on Biden, which is like sort of the most convenient, ideologically convenient of the things that Bernie did not do, right? And I include it. I feature it heavily in my piece because I consider an example of Bernie not really being very dynamic in terms of examining the different tools in his toolkit, whether or not it was the right tool or not. That was sort of the way I framed it. But obviously, for ideological reasons, if you're a leftist, it doesn't make you examine your sort of prior assumptions and think about ways you might have to be more accommodating to people who don't exactly agree with you, right?
Right, because Daniel, just to jump in for a second, it's not binary, right? It's not you attack Joe Biden or you don't. The question is you can challenge the political assumptions of a Joe Biden without making it without making it vituperative. And but I could tell you anecdotes about Bernie and me at dinner in 2015, talking about where I was the aggressive one and I got scolded for it. But the point is, it's not just on or off switch, right? It's how you go about it. And if you go about it in a certain way, you're alienating voters that you want to persuade. And so I just wanted to throw that in there.
Sure. No, and I would, right. And and the other thing, and the other response I've seen a lot of is sort of fatalism. I mean, people have latched on to, I think, with legitimate anger, the way that the Democratic establishment continued to press people to head to the polls on, March 17th and afterward, despite it clearly being dangerous during the pandemic, as a sign that they were effectively going to blackmail Bernie with mass murder if he didn't drop out. But the really decisive stuff had happened in South Carolina, Super Tuesday, and then March 10th before all that. So I don't totally buy that. And and again, I just encourage people to think of not what feels right. Politics isn't just a cultural activity or a spiritual activity. It's an activity about obtaining power and what the route to obtaining power is. And there may be state and local political systems or activist vehicles that allow people to feel less compromised in either their attitude about the tools that are required to achieve power or about the positions themselves and the policies and principles. But in the meantime, in the national arena of particularly presidential politics, particularly at a time where we're still living in the neoliberal paradigm, there are going to be political or tactical decisions that feel uncomfortable or hard, even just in terms of for something like maintaining message discipline, that may not feel like you're fully manifesting your political personality. In fact, they may feel like you're deliberately engaging in that act of spiritual negation that you mentioned, Richard. And that is part of what ways that the left has historically achieved power and continues to in other countries. And it's always worth examining.
Oh, I think that's so true, Daniel Marans. And I think that, look, you say you want a political revolution, a revolution. I'm not you personally. I mean, we're talking about the left in general. A revolution is not a dinner party. You got to make some tough choices. And along those lines, before I let you go, I do want to talk about another story you wrote, which I found intriguing. Sure. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, up for re-election, as all members of Congress are. She's been going hard against the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, for 2 years. They backed her opponent and so on. And now, interesting development, it's prepared to assist her and Rashida Tlaib of Michigan. Neither has reached out, but the DTRIP says they would stand by all their incumbents, including AOC, who's been directly critical of them. What do you make of that? I mean, I know their mission statement is supposedly to defend all incumbents, but is there I feel like there's a meta story here that I might be missing. Is there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that there's not a huge meta story in that.
Okay.
In that I genuinely think it's ambiguous, right? Like you can look at this and draw the lesson, well, haha, AOC should have been more thoughtful about who she picked fights with, or see, they're not that bad. Or you can say, well, look, she's put them in a box by criticizing them. Now they need to be consistent. Or you can doubt their sincerity, right? I mean, so there are a number of different ways to take it. But what just prompted me to reach out to the DCCC was, which again is the the campaign arm for House Democrats, which both tries to protect incumbents and expands Democratic control in the House, is that she is under attack, right? So she is now on the receiving end of a primary challenge from this former CNBC anchor, Michelle Caruso Cabrera. There are a number of other figures who are also challenging her, but this is somebody who's raised $1 million. I assume that when the FEC documents are digitized, we'll get a chance to look at just how many different special interest groups and ideologues are eager to sort of bloody AOC. Certainly the United States Chamber of Commerce has stepped into the Caruso Cabrera's corner. And it occurred to me that it would just be interesting to check to see whether the D-Trip, under the circumstances where somebody who ousted one of its incumbents and clearly inspired a D-Trip policy of greater vigilance toward incumbents, would openly and explicitly embrace helping her in her reelection, as they had professed that they would. And the real source of the instigating source of controversy was that in March 2019 they announced that they would not work with any private vendors who serve primary challengers. And at the time, this was, I think, correctly identified by AOC, by Ayanna Pressley, who also ousted an incumbent, as an effort to squelch dissension, to sort of reinforce already safe incumbents. In the vast majority of congressional districts in the country are only competitive in the primary, either the Democratic or Republican side. And people thought these are people with limited funds who already have trouble getting consultants. But the DCCC sort of said, just so you know, we would defend progressive incumbents as well. And, I'm in my journalism, I'm trying to hold them to it and keep an eye on that. And that's what I was just sort of trying to do. I also added something at the end there, which is that Speaker Pelosi made a point of campaigning for Henry Cuellar, another conservative Democrat who nearly lost his seat in early March with his due to a challenge that was backed by Justice Democrats and a number of other groups from attorney Jessica Cisneros. And she came down to his district and campaigned for him. And so I sort of said, well, would you do that for everybody? And I just think that if they're going to claim that they have a consistent standard, it was worth checking.
And she did. I'm reading your article now. The speaker strongly supports Congresswoman Tlaib and Ocasio-Cortez's reelection campaigns as they are both valued members of our caucus. And she says she can't get on the trail, which is true. So she answered in the affirmative, right?
That's right. And I think, look, there are other ways in which this stuff is manifest a bit more silently, but if they've hemmed themselves into a corner where now we're going to be looking at them to make sure that they are adhering to this policy consistently, then maybe it's a silver lining in terms of the heavy-handed approach that they take to their caucus. I think that, obviously more so even than the DCCC, Nancy Pelosi has clashed with the entire squad and really tried to marginalize them. So the idea of her having to go on the record and say, I'll put my name behind her and make sure I can do whatever I can, to me, it was at least just important to try to get on record for later on down the road. I don't know whether AOC or Tlaib, who frankly is more vulnerable because she represents a majority black district that she only narrowly won last time, I don't know that they would want to turn to either of these bodies, whether it's the Speaker's office or the DCCC, because of the beholdenness that it might put them in a position of having. And both of them seem to be fine in the fundraising department. But, again, it's just something, it's a dynamic to keep one's eye on. And, I'll say that I think one of the things that for those who are watching this show, listening to this show, and thinking about how they can get involved to build up the institutional left, to build up real power for the left. Now that Bernie has lost the nomination to Joe Biden, I think one of the answers is in supporting these primary challengers and nudging progressives in Congress to throw around their weight a little bit more vis-a-vis Pelosi. Because, for example, on something like remote or proxy voting, which would allow Congress to reconvene and act legislatively despite the pandemic, Pelosi has been a major obstacle, but there's no organized opposition to her within her own caucus. And that's something that people need to think very clearly about.
Yeah, I've always said you want a more progressive speaker, elect a more progressive Democratic caucus, and the speaker being elected by them will respond. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Daniel Marans, political reporter for HuffPost, as always, great and fascinating reporting. And as always, great talking to you. Thanks for coming on the program.
Great to be here as always, Richard.